Here.
Not as glad as I am, Pat. Thank you for that. It's lovely to see you appear.
Kevin, thank you so much for the introduction. Let me quickly first introduce myself. My name is Pat Davey. I work for the Community Security Trust. For those of you who don't know who the Community Security Trust is, we're the largest Jewish charity in the United Kingdom, and we're the ones responsible for the safety and security of all of the communal buildings amongst the Jewish community. I'm doing the organization a huge disservice, but the reason that we're here is to actually talk about hate crime. So if you want to know a little bit more about us, please feel free to email me, and I'm quite happy to talk to you at great length about what we actually do. Why am I talking to you about hate crime? Well, I spent 17 years as a serving police officer in Hertfordshire, 6 of which I was one of the 5 hate crime officers in the Hertfordshire region. And because of that, I became involved in vast amounts of training. And once I retired, I ended up working for the CST doing this. So today we're going to, in many respects, it's a very whistle-stop tour of hate crime. We could spend hours talking about the subtle nuances of hate crime, how it works, and how it affects communities. So in the 45 minutes or so that we actually have, I'm going to give you a quick overview of where we are, how it works. But before we start in the present, we kind of have to go back to the past. So let's, without further ado, jump in. I'm going to go out on a limb. Unfortunately, it being a Zoom webinar and nobody can answer me straight away, I'm going to make a huge assumption that you probably have never heard of this individual, Charles White. Why is he important in modern day hate crime? Well, he is, for all intents and purposes, what we now call the father of scientific racism. So, well, what does that mean? Well, his idea was that one race was superior to others, and that race must have evolved from a separate line. Now, it's not going to come as a gigantically huge shock to you that the race that he was talking about, he was superior, was obviously the white race, and everybody else was secondary to that. Why is that important? Apart from the fact that it's really a horrible line of thinking, which has no basis whatsoever in scientific fact. Well, his theory assisted the enslavement of millions of African men and women, and it still echoes in white supremacy ideology to this day. If you dig really deep into white supremacy ideology, you will find people like him. Maybe not this exact person, because he wasn't actually the first person to come up with this, but he certainly brought it to our shores. So let's kind of jump on a little ways. The two, for all intents and purposes, propaganda pieces that you actually see. The first one from 1853, the somewhat ape-esque individual sitting on the barrel of what I believe may be gin. I'm not entirely sure. He's actually a caricature of the Irish who went to the United States. And this idea that we have of this hugely welcoming idea of America throwing its doors open to all comers was not actually technically true. Because in many respects, what they were feeling in America at that time is what we see echoed today in a lot of the rhetoric and language that we see being pushed about. Especially around migrancy, immigration, communities, so on and so forth. So this inherent fear that these new people, these aliens, for want of a better word, were going to come and somehow destabilize the fabric of this society. Again, it didn't change a great deal in slightly under 50 years, with almost the exact same rhetoric being used against the Chinese community who came to the American shores to help build railways, to again enhance the community, to make the country what it is today. But then again, that's not really what these whole cartoons were about. They were about promoting fear. Of course, with fear comes hatred. So we have spoken to you about the past. Let's kind of jump into slightly more modern things. So let's jump ahead to the 20th century, and specifically the post-war years. And it was hugely important. With the damage caused by World War II, Britain needed to rebuild, and people from all over the then empire came to do so. And here's the thing, they came to do so willingly. They saw themselves as part of a greater whole, to create something that everyone could enjoy, to rebuild after the horrors of World War II. Unfortunately, by the 60s, racism was widespread and the Race Relations Act was implemented. Yeah, there was a lot of pushback, as you can imagine, about that because obviously people wanted the status quo to remain the same. But thankfully, it was a start. There are similar points in history. And here's the thing. Here's one of the seminal points. Stephen Lawrence. Every time I have given this presentation, I make no bones about this. Stephen Lawrence was killed because he was black. He is still the highest profile racial killing to date in the United Kingdom. Because of that, the Macpherson report found that people didn't want to report hate crime directly to the police. The dislike of the police, the fear of the organization, the fear of authority was absolutely huge. So in many respects, this was a huge step forward, unfortunately, due to this young man's tragic demise. Third-party reporting was born. And again, this was
Sorry, Pat, we're not able to see your slideshow at all.
My apologies. Let me see what we can do.
Apologies for butting in.
No, that's fine. That's fine. We're having slight technical problems. Let's see if I can reshare. How about that? We seeing anything now?
Yeah,
we are seeing it, but we're not seeing it in present. We're not seeing it in presentation mode. We're seeing it in
presenter.
Bear with me 1 second. I just bounce back out. We've recently upgraded to new teams, and it's not exactly playing the game as much as we would like. Bear with me 1 moment.
That's better.
Perfect.
Excellent. Lovely. So, as we were saying, Stephen Lawrence was a hugely seminal point. With third-party reporting, again, we took another huge step forward within hoping to eradicate hate from our countries. Other acts followed, and all attempting to create a fairer society. The Equalities Act of 2010, in total, as you can see on your screen, there are 9 protected characteristics. Of these 9 protected characteristics, this is what we draw our current hate crime legislation from. And I'm sure you're very much aware of it, but it doesn't do any huge harm to quickly go back over it. What you see on your screen, now that you can see the screen, is what we presently have as our template for current hate legislation. The 5 main characteristics. And this, again, is hugely important. This, because all legislation evolves, it changes, it moves with the time. Will we see anything new added to this? Quite possibly. With changes of government, changes of legislation, there is quite a large possibility that new strands will be added to this. One thing I do need to point out, because you are unique in your part of the world, you actually also record sex and gender the same way as you record any of the other 5 strands. And obviously, with misogyny being a hugely hot topic at this moment in time, not only within schools, but in day-to-day life, it's vitally important to do so, which again adds yet another safety net for our communities. So on saying that, it is important to actually understand one thing. And this is where a large amount of people kind of get very, very confused. There's actually no specific offense of hate crime. There are a number of pieces of legislation which have racial and religious elements to it, but there's no specific offense of hate. You see it in the news on a fairly regular basis, but many different offenses, from assault, damage, harassment, as you can see on the screen, can have hate elements to it. What is even more important, and again, which sets us apart from pretty much almost everybody else in the world, is this here. It's enough another person thought that the crime was hate related. Because ultimately, it gives another level of protection to the victims of hate crime. Because not everyone is aware of that legislation and what hate crime actually is. And again, we will come back to that later on in the presentation because it's actually rather important. So what really is it? What is hate crime? Well, there has to be a number of elements to it to kind of understand it. The current CPS guidelines that you have on your screen actually define what hostility is. And in many respects, if we actually take the dictionary definition of hostility, we actually can't go too far wrong. So it's everything that you see: resentment, dislike, unfriendliness, everything that you would consider hostility to actually be. So with that as a starting point, we also have to look at other parts of it. And again, this is more important when it comes for incident reporting. And I will touch on incidents slightly later on because we need to kind of understand the difference between a crime and an incident. Every single occurrence disturbs individuals or community or group. Because when it comes to hate, we're going to hopefully see by the end that it's not just a single individual that's affected. It is actually the community in its entirety. And again, as you can see, it causes them concern. So it gives us a very decent starting point to actually work from. You've heard me mention non-crime incidents. Well, before we actually go into the crime element of it, let me explain the non-crime incidents. A non-crime incident is something that doesn't quite meet the threshold of a crime. When we were teaching the younger police officers what it actually was, the simple question they would ask is, what's the difference? Well, the difference is has a crime been committed? Has someone been assaulted? Has been some form of verbal abuse? Has a public order act been committed? If the answer to these is no, then there's an incident. It was a lot simpler a number of, well, a year or so back. It has become ever so slightly more complicated now because there has to be a certain number of elements before this incident is finally recorded. It has caused some problems within communities who feel that somehow this legislation is leaving them behind, but there is some logic behind it because it has to be motivated by hostility, which we have already seen, a dislike, a contempt. There must be a form of prejudice. And again, the dictionary definition of prejudice stands. And again, there has to be three other parts to it, that it's not irrational, it's not trivial, and it's not malicious. Probably the easiest way to explain this is by giving you a very, very quick example. I won't bore you with the details. When I was a hate crime officer, there was an individual who had a neighbor dispute. The neighbor dispute was effectively getting out of hand, and one of the final complaints was that the individual was putting his bins out in a racist manner. Well, the simple fact of the matter, once we've investigated, was the individual was simply putting his bins out. So here we have a perfect example of not only irrational, not only trivial, but also clearly malicious. Because the person who's complaining about the wheelie bins was actually the individual who's causing the problems for his neighbor. So to understand that, we can understand why the new recording standards have come in. That ultimately, it again gives safeguarding to those who have actual crimes or incidents committed against them. I'm not going to go too deeply into the four dimensions of racism and actually forget about racism because it can simply be hate, but it serves its purpose here as a halfway decent graphic. Institutional, and we hear this on a fairly regular basis. Well, let's use institutions who have policies and procedures which simply discriminate against a certain group of people. Structural is effectively a societal version of institutional. That society itself is effectively working in favor of one group against another. The other two are actually more important to us. The interpersonal, the small and not so small racist acts obviously fall under that. But there's also something called microaggressions. And again, bear with me, we shall explain a bit more on that one. And of course, the internalized, the biases that we may or may not have, depending on who you are, which again affect how we actually interact with people. So it's an interesting way of kind of checking whether or not any of this tends to affect us. In many respects, it won't, because institutional structural racism doesn't really affect the vast majority of the people in the United Kingdom. But for minority communities, it most definitely becomes something which is problematic. Microaggressions, on the other hand, and it is a phrase which we have acquired from our American colleagues, is remarks, questions, actions that are painful because they have to do with a person's membership of a group that's discriminated against or subject to stereotypes. And the key part of what makes them so disconcerting is they happen casually, frequently, and often without any harm intended, and normally in everyday life. And of course, in many respects, it creates almost a three-tier system of crime, non-crime, and microaggressions. Microaggression is not something that the police will ever deal with, but it effectively others that individual from that community. Again, usually without any harm, malice, or intent. But again, it just makes people feel that you are not part of the greater whole. Again, the actual definition is what you see on your screen. Effectively a more wordy version of what I have just said. But again, it's you as that marginalized group are not as welcome or do not feel as welcome as everybody else. And again, small, subtle, unintentional. More importantly, they are dismissive of your experience. And that's really where othering very much comes in, that your experience is not worth as much than mine because of who you are. And this is incredibly important when it comes to understanding how hate crime can have massive, massive effects, not only to the individual, but to the community that that individual belongs to as well. So it begs the question, who commits hate crime? Again, a topic which we could spend absolutely hours on. So I'm going to try in a short period of time to explain as much as I can. One of the ideas is what you have on your screen, the perpetrators of racial harassment and racial violence, SIBIT. For want of a better word, it's the theory of the apple never falls far from the tree concept. Again, the idea that those brought up within racist environments are most likely to, again, hold racist ideas. It's a good enough starting point, but it has certain flaws. There's huge amounts of assumptions made that everybody brought up in a racist environment ultimately becomes racist. That's not necessarily the case. One thing we can agree that our formative years begin with our parents and our relatives, but external factors have as great, if not a greater, influence on us. So again, it shows that those who are maybe not brought up in a household who is racist can ultimately be drawn in with friends, colleagues, workplaces, clubs, so on and so forth, into that racist form of thinking. And when I use racist, I actually mean hate in all of its 5 strands completely. There are another number of groups, the thrill seekers. Thrill seekers really have no great ideology. They simply do it because it's fun and it's annoying and it gets them notice and attention. In many respects, even though I'm loath to use hate crime and antisocial behavior because they are actually very, very different, there's elements that cross over, of course, but that's the same thing. This low-level irritant behavior, but they don't really buy it. They don't really believe it. They're calling somebody racist names one day and they're breaking down trees and shrubberies the next because it's entertaining to do. The second, the area defenders or territory defenders, they're the ones who actually have this element of fear that somehow, again, their little world is going to change. They're coming over here, taking my job, so on and so forth. This is phrases that we hear on a regular basis. These are the ones who are terrified of that. And again, going back to the original comment about the Irish and the Chinese in America, this was very much the demographic change that they were terrified about. Retaliatory offenders, they're the ones who tend to read newspapers, quick skim of the articles, and form opinions based on that. Again, either real or perceived slights. Again, you see a large amount of this coming out of the woodwork if something happens within the world. One of the things I always did every day before I started work was read the local paper and read the world headlines, because it would have a knock-on effect to the hate crimes that I would be dealing with. And the final group is this, the mission offenders. These are the ones who are the ideology motivated ones, or for want of a better word, the true believers. The ones who have immersed themselves within those ideologies of hatred for any and all groups, depending on who they are, based on, again, potentially coming from a family background or being parts of groups who are, we know, perpetrate these hateful ideologies. So there are a vast amount of other individuals, again, who cross over between 1, 2, 3, and 4. We could be here for hours discussing them. One thing we do know for a fact is switch on the internet and you will see all manner of things which will potentially annoy, offend, or horrify you. You will also see lots of things which are highly entertaining and good as well. Unfortunately, in my world, I tend to deal with things that are horrible. One thing we do know is the internet, as this quote says, didn't change things massively. It was social media. Social media gave voice to the voiceless. So every opinion that we wanted or did not want, as the case may be, is now out there for us to freely browse, or not, if you're like me, and definitely not on Twitter or any other form of social media. Well, one thing we do know is one of the biggest problems we have is trying to explain complex ideas in a very, very small number. 280 characters, I am led to believe, is how many you can have on X, the former Twitter. Please forgive me if that's wrong. My information on this one may be out of date, but I think it serves its purpose. 280 characters, just for sake of interest, is between 46 to 94 words. Explain the current state of the world in 46 to 94 words. I challenge you. I certainly could not. And unfortunately, neither can anybody else. But what we can do is pop out box pop messages. And again, they are designed to be catchy and quick and interesting and inflame. One of the biggest problems that we actually have at this moment in time is this. Freedom of speech, not freedom of reach. Elon Musk's wonderful statement when he effectively deregulated his platform X, basically stating that unless you go looking for hateful comments, you're not going to find them. And freedom of speech is paramount. Without it, we are living in some quasi-fascist state. Whether you believe him or not is entirely up to you. But there is, again, a small flaw in this otherwise, shall we say, interesting thought process of his. I'm pretty sure that very few of you here are interested or even listen about the ultra low emission zone in London, but you'd be surprised at the amount of people who really don't like it. I simply picked this because it was topical at the time and I never got around to changing it. What I did find was of the 7 comments on this page, close to 50% had racist or were overtly racist overtones. In fact, I could have picked pretty much any story anywhere about anything, and I get a fairly similar average no matter where you go, because it seems that in this day and age, you can't comment on anything without someone dragging some form of hate speech into it to try make their point. I was interested in the individual in question, and it seems that he pretty much hates everybody. His attempt to veil his clearly racist language didn't do particularly well. It's entirely up to yourself if you can actually pick it out, but it is most certainly there. One of the issues that we have with this, with Vox Populi, with the fact of being able to express opinions absolutely everywhere, is we are finding it harder and harder to dispel that misinformation that is online. There's a huge crossover now between various different groups and individuals like this. And so therefore, we know that this sort of thing certainly has a huge reach with people. And again, it changes people's mindsets, especially towards marginalized groups. We know this for a fact because during the coronavirus crisis, we saw East Asian and Southeast Asian hate crime go up by 21%. I'm not a huge fan of statistics for various different reasons, and I always like to make sure that we actually know that the people we're speaking about are human. Jonathan Mock, prime example, he was attacked by a group because they didn't want your coronavirus in their country. As we always say, hate crimes always has a human face. One of the problems that we actually have with the internet is it perpetuates this huge amount of bigotry that's out there. It is incredibly easy to turn around and say sorry, my apologies. It's hugely easy for most people to turn around and actually push that methodology and ideology across. And this is what we're actually seeing. In fact, it's hugely prevalent in all various different terms. So one thing that we actually do know is this idea that this language, which is hugely prevalent on the internet, is going to have a huge impact on how we actually view hate crime. And again, especially for those in vulnerable communities, they are the ones who are very much on the receiving end of this form of rhetoric. Again, something else that we're actually seeing is hugely important, that again, we're actually starting to notice that we are moving away from believing believable sources, our police, our government, because it is far easier to believe the vox pop opinions of those on the internet with their 280 characters rather than those who are actually within the know. And even those within the know are seen as some form of elitist and not to be trusted. I'm going to ask you one thing. Try not to focus too much on the actual picture, and we'll come back to that in a second. But please focus on the amount of likes, shares, and comments. 600 likes, over 800 comments, and again, 600 shares, and plus every other share that we don't have on this. For all this, this was an image put out by Britain First. If you actually now look at the image, it makes no sense whatsoever. If we're boycotting bigotry and then a call to kill all non-Muslims, that statement is illogical. It makes no sense whatsoever. But of course, it makes a lot more sense when we see the actual original picture. The photograph, again, taken at an anti-hate march in Washington, D.C., but again, changed and adapted by Britain First to suit their ends. One would argue that by simply reading boycott bigotry and kill all non-Muslims, the statement itself is illogical and, again, as I say, makes no sense. We don't care because it pushes that sentiment out there and, again, increases that feeling of fear and rage and hatred, which these pressure groups want to use. And again, it makes, unfortunately, dealing with them rather difficult. Online hate crime, even though we're getting better at it, was always a huge thorn in our sides. And they can be more difficult to deal with than crimes which are committed in the real world, so to speak, rather the real physical world rather than the real online world. One of the things that we do know is this, that the best way to actually make sure that posts that we have seen, such as that from Britain First, is, again, be a selective sharer. When something is sent to you, verify before sharing and commenting on it. These posts are simply designed to increase rage and hatred of minority groups, which are already feeling pressure from hate crimes from all of the sources. So again, take time to stop and see whether or not the image that you are being sent is manipulated or real. One thing we do know is fake news is something that's been there for absolutely ages, and hate crime is certainly one of it. Mark Twain said this back in the day, and it is as true then as it is today. The funny thing about it, Mark Twain was one of the original proponents of fake news. He was not above making complete fabrications for his stories and then selling them as the real thing, which caused on all manner of problems back in his day. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be a training day without some form of statistics. So, without further ado, let's jump in. This is our current state of hate crime. The last set of statistics come through from His Majesty's Government and the Home Office. As you can see, there is actually a decrease in hate crime, all bar transgender hate, which has gone up quite significantly by 11%. Although seeing the newspapers and the amount of hate against the trans community, that again is hardly surprising. Why has hate crime gone down? Year upon year, hate crime has always risen. Well, the way that non-crime incidents have been recorded potentially may be a reason why. There also, again, may be a fear of distrust element towards authority, again, which we have mentioned because it is easier to get information from Twitter and TikTok and so on and so forth, and especially with those individuals constantly spouting, trust not the authority, they are not on your side. One thing we do know is Islamophobia has risen by 39%. It has dropped. It was 41 the year before last. We know this is going to go up. Present world situation has certainly seen an increase in not only anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia. Hate crimes around sexual orientation has gone up 112% in the last 5 years. Yes, there's a small drop this year, but again, it is a marginal amount given the amount of hate crimes that has happened in the last 5 years. And again, it'll be interesting to see what these figures are this year. Again, a small drop in disability, but again, this simply may be around recording more so than anything else. But again, 1% increase doesn't really outweigh very much against the 43% increase in the years previous. And again, 1.8% of the trans population, as you can see on the screen, has reported transphobic hate crime. Now, that's reported, not experienced. Right? The experience is going to be far, far higher. So here's the thing. I've said before, I'm not a huge fan of statistics. They have their place. They're vitally important. And again, I always encourage people to report hate, because without statistics, hate crime falls further and further down the list of importance in the government. But hate crime always has a human face. And these are some of them. Of the 4 people here, 3 of them were hate-related murders, and one is hard to classify, but through in action, maybe somebody, or through some form of action, maybe it could have saved the lady's life. Let's start with Christine Lanisky. Christine Lanisky was a very unwell woman. She had learning disabilities, but she also had a large amount of physical problems as well. She took ill and died very close to her own doorstep. And instead of being helped, some of the local youths decided to urinate on her and cover her in shaving foam, calling her all manner of disability discriminatory names and filming it for YouTube because they thought it was going to be funny. Jody Dabrowski beaten to death because he was gay, beaten so badly that he had to be identified by his dental records. Johnny Delaney was kicked to death by a group of young boys who called him a dirty jippo, amongst other names and phrases that I'm not going to use over the open airwaves, again resulting in his death. And Stephen Hoskins. Stephen Hoskins would probably now be referred to as a victim of cuckooing. He was befriended by a group of individuals who led him around his flat on a dog collar, burned him with cigarettes, spent all of his money, sold his belongings, and when he was of no further use to him, brought him to the local viaduct, made him hang by his fingers over the edge, stamped on his fingers, causing him to fall to his death. I always say hate crime is not just hurty words, because we hear this on a regular basis. Oh, people are so weak, and hate crime is just something to help solve feelings. Hate crime has real world implications. And these are just a few of the people that I've picked. I often ask ourselves a question. I mean, Reverend King spoke these words in the 1960s, and how far have we come since then? Well, this is London in 2019, where 2 women were attacked by a group of young men who demanded that they kiss, and when they refused to do so, assaulted them, as you can see, badly on a bus in central London. So the answer to my question is clearly not far enough. Why is all this important? Well, it's important because, as I said, hate crime affects the individual, but it affects the community as well. And the community remembers, because my very poorly drawn graph, please forgive me for this one, we have an incident, something happens, a gurdwara is burned down, a community centre is burned down, there is hate elements to it. We, and I always say we when we refer to the police, you can't not after 17 years, we come in, we do our thing. The fire is put out, we start our investigations. Once we have done, it fades from our memory. For the community, that effect in the community remains far, far longer. Not only does it have an effect on the community that owned that property or was affected by that incident, but it also has an effect on the far wider community. So say a mosque is burned down, the local synagogue becomes incredibly worried. Are they next? So does the local temple. All minority communities suddenly are a lot more worried in case they are next, because that's the ramifications of hate crime. It is like throwing a rock into a pond. The ripples go out further and further. And ultimately, this becomes a new normal. We no longer feel as safe as we did. We are no longer feeling as welcome as we once did. So the reality of the new normal may actually be the red line, where people remember for a far, far longer time than they ever will of anything good that happens to that community. And that's the thing with cultural memory and hate crime. It remains. Stephen Lawrence, prime example. How many years have passed since his death? And Stephen Lawrence still remains a fixed focus when it comes to hate crime and also within his community. As I said, we live in this interconnected world, and we've spoken about hate crime on the internet, but everyone's experiences of hate crime is completely different. The Oxford Internet Survey back in 2019, when we were still doing interesting things like this prior to the pandemic, showed how all of our experiences are completely different. The Black individual's experience is completely different to a white individual's experience when it comes to observing and receiving hateful, abusive emails. And this is simply just hateful and abusive emails, as opposed to everything else that will happen in their lives. Far significantly higher. But even others, and unfortunately the other is not the best way of actually describing it. This was every other community who didn't either identify as either white, Asian, or Black. And again, their figures are very, very similar. Yes, the white community may have observed that hateful content, but they receive very, very little of it. Although this is slowly but surely starting to change, and sadly not for the way we would like. There's a concept now called the victim to victimizer. Again, started in the United States and is surely but surely starting to seep its way over here, where those who have been victimized are entitled to use any and all methods to victimize their former oppressor. So what we're actually seeing now, and especially again on social media, is this huge anti-white rhetoric that's being pushed from places like the United States, where white people are demonized in any possible way, up to and including calls for violence against them, because as the colonial white oppressor, they have no place on in the law. They certainly can't be victims of hate crime. I wish to disabuse you of that notion. British hate crime, UK hate crime, covers everybody within the United Kingdom. So this idea is certainly moot over here, but again, we're starting to see it being pushed forward as a potential idea. And it will change the way we potentially look at hate crime as well. Again, when we're looking at hate crime, we have to start looking at people in a holistic sense. We are not just Black, we're not just white. We may be white and disabled, we may be Black and gay, we may be Muslim and trans. We have to look at it as everybody is part of a greater whole. And again, this has a way, it's hugely important when it comes to actually recording hate crime as well. So the initial incident may be one of a hate crime against disability, but there must be maybe other elements again as well that we have to look at. One of the biggest problems that we actually have when it comes to hate crime is lawful but awful. Or in other words, popular politics, speaking for every man. What does that actually mean? Well, in many respects, and I have used Donald Trump as the most obvious individual who tends to use this language, he has mainstreamed hate speech. A large amount of the things that we would have said years ago, so I wouldn't have said years ago, I should say, certainly now has become acceptable. Because if our politicians are saying it, if our people in power are saying it, then why shouldn't I? I'm just telling the truth, or rather, I'm just telling it like it is. Well, yes, that's the whole point of populist politics. They do that, but forgetting that by othering minority groups, you are effectively creating huge amounts of disparity between one group and the other, and that way lies trouble. Or in other words, when the unsayable becomes sayable, and we are starting to see this. There used to be a running joke in the hate crime world. The one defense you got on a fairly regular basis when someone was dealt with for any form of hate speech was, I can't be racist, I have Black friends. Yes, that's not a defense that could ever hold up in law. Ultimately now, the populist ideas that are being pushed forward almost reinforce this idea. I'm not racist, I am simply just pointing out the truth to you. Well, truth is subjective. And again, hate speech. What is hate speech designed to do? Well, it's designed to injure, dehumanize, harass, intimidate, degrade, and victimize targeted groups. But more importantly, it is designed to encourage others to do the same. And again, this brings us back to the point that we made before, this idea that this hate speech that's out there, this kind of changing away of trusting authority, is again making that disinformation hugely hard to dispel. Because these individuals aren't spouting hate anymore, they're just telling it like it is. Ultimately, and again, the pyramid of hate is a lovely idea, but it is wildly unlikely we will ever see genocide in our country. I touch Formica or IKEA in this case to make sure that's not the case. But one thing we will most definitely see is bias and acts of individual prejudice, quite possibly leading up to discrimination. These are your day-to-day hate offences that we actually see on a regular basis. And again, ultimately leading to the apex of the pyramid, which is genocide. The pyramid is a nice idea, but people tend to get fixated with the top when the reality, the bottom layer is actually probably the ones that's most important. By trying to remove that bias from our communities, the rest of the pyramid does not stand. So, a long way to go? Possibly yes. These are some of the questions that we hear on a regular basis, or some of the statements, I should say, that we hear on a regular basis. Isn't it something we just have to put up with? And again, this was something said by some members of the LGBTQ plus community that I was speaking to. It becomes so commonplace and day to day. It's something that we just live with, you know. And when I asked why don't you report it, the answer was quite interesting. That the daily abuse is so commonplace that it's almost pointless to do so, because ultimately it leads us into this. They don't want to waste police time. They understand that maybe not a lot can be done. What is interesting is in the cases of violence, people are more happy to report to the police than they would when it comes to just abuse in the streets or abuse that they receive online. And that's a notion that we really need to start trying to disabuse people of, to kind of move them into that situation where reporting becomes commonplace, because without knowing about hate crime, again, it falls from the public consciousness. And ultimately, what is the point of reporting? Again, I don't want to be one of those old police officers who kind of points blame at my ex-colleagues, but sometimes it is our fault because we don't really understand the subtle nuance of it. Sometimes it is simply the system. We can do a fantastic job and Crown Prosecution Service may not work according to plan, or sometimes a case simply falls apart. So again, it's about managing expectations and again, being empathetic to the victims of hate. There's also, of course, the fear of police and authority, because not everybody comes from our country. Individuals who come here as refugees, asylum seekers, will have had authorities where you certainly cannot simply just walk up to them. They are not, for all intents and purposes, police. They are militia or parts of the uniformed government establishment, and they certainly are not people that you particularly wish to approach. So again, these barriers need to be slowly but surely broken down. And despite a vast amount of awareness campaigns, we still have numbers of groups of people who simply just don't realize what a hate crime is, or that they can do something about it. And maybe in many respects that ties back into the not wasting police time or not thinking that anything can be done. And then, of course, there's fear of consequences. And this is quite a nuanced thing. Some communities will actively encourage their members not to report to the police. Other members of that community may not be out. So you have to be incredibly careful not to out members of the community to other members of the community. So again, when it comes to dealing with hate crime, there has to be a level of sensitivity around that. We have to look at it again from a holistic point of view to make sure that we are ensuring not only that this community gets the best service, but that it is done so safely and empathetically as well. Ultimately, how do we deal with hate? It's difficult. We have, of course, vast amounts of legislation, but when it comes to hate online, and again, we need to start looking at critical thinking and hate speech. We have to make sure that we are making sure that people are asking the right questions, especially when it comes to our youth. Sometimes maybe their language isn't nuanced enough to not cause offense when no offense is actually intended. So vilifying people who make mistakes may not be the way forward, by gently pointing out that this is incorrect or not, or maybe potentially offensive, may be a far better way to get people online. No one reacts particularly well to being shouted down and accused. For a very, very long time, I shied away from using this slide because, again, privilege is a word which has been very much usurped, especially by the far right. Who see it as some sort of racial slur, something that has to be stopped at all costs. But let's not look at skin color. Let's not look at middle class. Let's look at university level education, anything like this. Let's look at this from privilege in its most basic form. Your average bus is designed for an individual who is fully able to be able to walk down narrow corridors, even when that bus is moving. What it's not designed for is a man or woman pushing a pushchair or a person in a wheelchair. Okay, there's areas for them, but generally the vast majority of the bus is for able-bodied individuals who can move down. And that ultimately explains privilege. It's designed by people for people like them. And that's ultimately what privilege actually is, a society designed by an individual for individuals like them. So when we're talking about privilege, we have to kind of look further as well. It's a divisive topic. It's probably one that's certainly worth more study. One thing is certainly important is we need to listen and learn. Experience is huge. It's very, very easy to poo-poo stories that we read, and especially in the media, who always put their own spin on it when it comes to elements of racism. We weren't there. We don't know what that individual experienced. So when it comes, and especially as practitioners of hate crime, everyone's experience is equally as valid as yours. You know, and it's important to actually include and collaborate with diverse groups because their experience is hugely important, because we can learn from this, we can feed into that, we can learn and adapt, especially when it comes around legislation and best practice. Because again, without changing things for the better, things simply just remain the same. I always say I may end up doing myself out of a job in this situation. Make space for the right person. You know, I am a white, middle-aged Irishman talking about hate crime. Maybe I am not the right person to do so, even though my intentions are honest and honorable. Perhaps we need more people from different communities, again, explaining their experience to make hate crime a tangible, real thing that we understand. And again, be mindful of our language. Some of the words we use are incredibly exclusionary, some downright offensive, even though not meant to be. Some are ableist. You know, and again, how does this affect marginalized communities? Now, I'm not asking you to take every word that you speak out of your mouth and look at it, because that's ridiculous. We are simply human beings and we make mistakes. But again, to consider how our actions impact on others is vitally important. Maybe we don't. Maybe it has very little impact. But again, to make a more equitable society requires work. And it requires work from absolutely everyone within that community. So combating hate online, well, first off, as I've always said, be calm, calm down. Do not jump at the first thing that tries to make you bite, because that's what it's designed to do. If that sort of thing is there, remember to kind of push forward this idea that the people that you are calling various different names, they're people as well, people with real lives, real feelings, real family, real connection. That human-based narrative is hugely important. That's not going to work on everybody. That's one thing for a fact, but it may make people pause for thought. Ultimately, if none of that works, remind the author of the consequences of their action. Thankfully, our legislation does deal with online as well. I said before, it's more difficult, but it is there and it is becoming more and more effective. Remember, you can always report to the administrators and also to social media platforms, although that can actually be a little bit of an uphill battle. There's also reported.org, which is the online website for reporting not only hate crime, but also offensive material that you see online. If you're a victim of hate online, taking a screenshot. Sometimes these comments can be removed. It makes gathering evidence rather difficult. Always report it to the police. It's vitally important that you do so. I'll leave it up to you whether you want to block or mute the abuser. That's very much down to you. And more importantly, never ignore it. One thing that is vitally important before we come almost to the end of today's presentation, and thank you for sticking with me for so long, is this. Put it into real world terms. Why is hate crime important? Hate crime is important because it affects all of our communities. We may not realize it, but hate crime committed against minority communities has a knock-on to every other part of the community. It instills fear, it instills hatred, it instills othering. And it's this climate of exclusion and intimidation, which slowly but surely begins to filter out everywhere. It's this almost esoteric dread that hate crime creates that we need to actually deal with, drag it into the light, and make sure that those who commit these offences are dealt with robustly. These are just some of the organisations that are available. I've stopped trying to give a list because I speak to various different communities all over the United Kingdom. All I say is have a look around your community, see what's out there. There's going to be loads of groups out there who help victims of hate crime. These are some of the UK-based ones. If you can't find anything, get in contact with your local community safety unit. I'm sure they will have lists as well. And our final piece of advice is this: don't suffer in silence. No matter what people tell you, report it. It is vitally important. Always make a note of what was said, and especially if there's anybody around. Evidence is key when it comes to any crime. And always remember, there is no excuse for hate crime whatsoever. You are the victim. The problem is with the offender. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not entirely sure how it's now going to run. This is my email address. If anybody is interested in contacting me in any way, shape, or form, please feel free to do so. I'll leave that for a second or so, but I believe my colleagues have my email address, so if you require it, please feel free to get in contact with the organisers. This QR code brings us to our website. Thank you so much. That pretty much concludes my part of today's proceedings, and I'll hand back to the moderator. Thank you so much for listening.
Pat, thank you very much. That's I don't need to have a chorus of noise in the background. I think I speak for all of us. That was, and the reactions are coming in there, which affirms I'm going to say it's really, really entertaining, useful, engaging. Thank you. It's vastly more than I anticipated, and it's exceeded, I think, everyone's expectations. That's wonderful. To give that sort of local context as well, and it follows on from some of the issues that Pat's mentioned there in terms of reporting, and I think this is the responsibility it places in there. I just want to bring in Jonathan Ford, who is a diverse communities team leader from Plymouth. John's going to give I would suggest, a much more specialist view than I'm going to be able to offer. John, thank you very much.
Could I just ask Claire, could you just pop the slide down so that we can spotlight John for everybody, and then when we finish, we'll pop that slide back up. Thank you.
I'm not sure if
Over
Pat's
to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm not sure if Pat's still sharing or whether I've just got Pat's photo or a symbol. There we go. I think that's come off now. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's John Ford. I'm a Diverse Communities Team Sergeant, one of 4 within Devon and Cornwall. Not every police force has a Diverse Communities Team, but it's something that's been within Devon and Cornwall for a number of years now. I'm going back 15 or so years, and it's something that we take very seriously, and with pride that we actually have a diverse communities team, essentially to look at hate crime, to review and give tactical advice to colleagues, but also to go and engage with those diverse communities to be able to then build that confidence and trust that what Pat was talking about. By no means is I've got a quick presentation that I will bring up. I will go through that a bit quicker now, because by no means is my presentation going to be as thorough as Pat's, which is excellent, and one that I've had the pleasure of sitting through before. I am just going to share my screen because it will give me a bit of a guide. I have been noting some of the comments in the chat bar, so hopefully I will cover some of those. What happens next? What about hate speech? But if I don't, when I come to the end of any questions, please make sure that you ask me and I can pick those up within that. So just bear with me while I share my screen, and hopefully this will work as smoothly as Pat's.
That's working. We can see it, but we can still sit in presenter mode rather than actual presenting.
I'm hoping that's just changed.
It has. Perfect. Thank you.
Lovely. That's great. So yet. There might be a slight lag in my computer then. So as I said, Pat went through a detail of what is a hate crime. We touched briefly on non-crime hate incidents, the impact of hate. So what I will do, there's a couple of videos that might play, hopefully they will, but there were a few points within Pat's presentation which would slightly differ for Devon and Cornwall and our recording standards. Why is this not moving on? There we go. So what I'm quickly going to go through is, the role of the diverse community teams, something about diversity and respect, hate crime, and this was in the chat bar, what and how to report. I'm not going to go through the PREVENT program, which is your radicalization and extremism, but obviously through the diverse communities team out there with our engagement with hard to reach or seldom heard communities. It's something that we just bear in mind as part of our daily business, as it were. I'm hoping this will play and you can all hear it. If it doesn't, please let me know.
It's moving.
I've
but
got
there's
no sound.
No sound?
No sound.
Okay, let me pause that a minute. The videos may not work if I don't know if I don't think this
Still
is,
no sound.
yeah, I don't think that's going to work, unfortunately. I've got sound. I don't know how to share the sound. That's my technical abilities. But that's something you can find on YouTube. It's a national hate crime video. So if it's something you're interested in, then you can find that video and I can send the link later. I'm just going to go back to sharing this. Yes.
When you share your screen, there's a slider at the top of it that says include sound.
Okay.
I don't know if that is relevant to us not hearing it.
It didn't come up first time. It just says stop sharing or sharing your screen. I don't have any audio, so.
If you stop sharing and then go to reshare, as you click the share button right at the top on the right hand side, there should be a little toggle button that you can click.
Top on the right hand side. So I'm going back to sharing.
Yeah. Click the share button and hopefully before you actually share it at the top on the right hand side, it should be a toggle button.
No, I'm not seeing it.
I have just put the link to it in the chat as well. We will send the link out with the email that goes out afterwards, so people can see it afterwards.
Yeah, sorry, you're going to have to send my apologies on that one, but I don't want to waste your time with my lack of IT skills. So hopefully you're seeing what the role of the diverse communities team in. So where Pat talked about obviously hate as a whole, our role within Devon and Cornwall Police is to develop and maintain working relationships with partners, local businesses, key individuals, our hard to reach or seldom communities, and try to deliver that problem solving approach to minority concerns and issues. It's about developing an understanding of our communities and to enable them, all functions of the police, to respond to the needs of those communities. It's to monitor and reduce community tensions by being that point of contact, having built that trust and confidence and going out to do engagements on a weekly basis, builds that trust, and you'll find that people will come to the diverse communities teams where they've met not only the officer, but that officer then becomes a person and a human being. Those relationships are formed and they will come and tell us around those tensions, and that allows us to monitor those better. We obviously work to increase the reporting of hate crime and hate incidents, of which Pat did discuss, and I'll quickly go through the nuances of those. Look to support and give tactical advice to our fellow colleagues who are investigating hate crimes. Sorry, someone trying to get hold of me? Someone else's microphone on in the background. I'll keep going. And then obviously we contact victims of hate crime to offer support and signposting. To make sure that they have that confidence within policing to report. So, as much as Pat said historically, underrepresented communities feel that there's no voice or subject to inequality from local authorities with the environment of mistrust, isolation and anger. We can see that ends up in a result, and those being like the riots listed on your screen, the aftermath of the Stephen Lawrence case, the LA riots, the death of George Floyd, and the arson to the suites, the hotel suites in Liverpool with the asylum seekers and refugees. So that might bring it a little bit closer to home, especially that last one, because we have had migrant hotels within Devon and Cornwall. So these worldwide events, Pat talked about that ripple effect. So we're always looking at international, national and regional news and media stories, because whatever's portrayed in the media really does have an impact on the communities and on hate crime and hate incidents recorded within Devon and Cornwall Police. I won't go through these because Pat's done a lot of that. So, as Pat said, hate crime is harmful because it targets a person's identity, who that person is, and we obviously, as a police service, will not tolerate that happening, and we want to increase reporting of hate crime. No two individuals are ever the same, so we embrace the individuality and help to put an end to hate crime by getting people to report it. So I saw in the chat bar, well, how is that done? So, as I said, we monitor those hate crimes and incidents. If it is reported, which is either done online through the Devon and Cornwall website, and that's where I would advise people to go if it's not an ongoing incident, if there's no immediate threat of danger or risk to life or risk to property, rather than do the 101 on the phone calls, for which some people may have had an experience, generally a poor experience of 101 and being on a phone call waiting for somebody to answer that. The new online reporting is very quick, it's very easy to follow, and does have a hate crime section. So we want that reported. When we do, that creates an occurrence or creates a reference number for that victim of crime, but it will then allow an officer to be given that to investigate. So we provide that officer with that tactical advice and guidance around hate crime. We do that so that we have a consistent approach to investigating hate crime, and we have the diverse communities teams have designed a hate crime response guidance so that that consistent approach is followed. We obviously want to ensure that the victim needs are met. A victim of hate crime is a priority victim. They're entitled to an enhanced service, which means to be contacted within 24 hours to make sure that they're aware that we have received that complaint, that it will be investigated fully. And obviously we are evidence-led. So we will investigate all matters criminal, whether that leads to or away from a person that's named as the suspect. But we're also able to, with the relationships we have within our third sector or charity partners, partnerships, agencies, local authorities, we're able to appropriately support and signpost that victim to additional help. And of course, we seek to reduce repeat victimization for that victim. I'm going to move on. So, when Pat was speaking within his presentation, he mentioned the Equality Act 2010 and that there were the 9 protected characteristics. For hate crime, we actually, or within law with the CPS, there are only 5 which will carry greater weight. So there is a separation between the Equality Act and hate crime. So the 5 protected characteristics, which will either have a sentence uplift, so the judge will have more power to give a greater punishment if somebody is found guilty or convicted within court, or have an aggravating factor. So you got your race and religiously aggravated offences. But of course, we do have the other protected characteristics, which doesn't fall under and doesn't have its own statutory law. We then have aggravating factors that make this a hate crime or make that particular incident a hate crime, which will then allow the judge or the magistrates within court to have a sentence uplift to reflect that personal attack, because no crime, you know, or any crime is not nice, but if you are being targeted for who you are, then that's recognised either by that legislation with a racially and religiously aggravated criminal offence, or by that sentence uplift through the aggravating factor of that hate element recognised in law. So the 5 monitored strands is disability, race, religion or belief, sexual orientation and transgender identity, as you can see on the screen in front of you. But within Devon and Cornwall, we also monitor sex or gender. So we're looking at misogyny and misandry as well. We obviously focus on getting it right first time. So as I mentioned, there are 4 diverse communities teams. So there's 1 for Exeter, East and Mid and North and West Devon, 1 for South Devon. I sit within Plymouth with a team of officers, and then you have Cornwall and Isles of Scilly. And we're there to make sure that our officers do their utmost best to get it right first time. We need to understand that impact on the victim, including that psychological impact, which is far-reaching, more than just the victim. Obviously, it's their family, it's their friends, it's the community that they live within. If we get it wrong, the impact is huge on the police service and the reputation of the police service, which is why we take a victim-focused approach and a trauma-informed approach. So, when a hate crime is reported to the police, we would ask the victim and those witnesses within that situation to make a statement. Now, we do appreciate not every victim wishes to make a statement, but in that case, we would ask them still to report it. They're being victim-led and victim-focused doesn't mean that they will then have to follow through that criminal justice route. We will not force anyone into making a statement. We will not take it out of their hands. We will gather the evidence, as I said, all evidence, whether that's digital media, CCTV, phones, seasoned phones, texts, emails, anything that's going to assist to prove that offence. But as I said, we must be evidence-led, and this is where it falls down a lot of the time in any crime investigation, not just only hate crime investigation. You know, it's having that criminal threshold of beyond all reasonable doubt that offence took place, and that evidence must be, you know, the threshold is high, as I said, for that. Unlike civil law, where it's on the balance of probabilities that what's been reported has happened. So once that evidence has been gathered, then the suspect can be spoken to, either arrested or being asked to be interviewed as a voluntary attender at a police station, and they would have the evidence put to them in interview. Once that's done, that will be reviewed by an evidential review officer to look at what the Crown Prosecution Service and the gravity matrix. So all hate crime will be reviewed by the Crown Prosecution Service if it meets that threshold to look at a charge or a caution. So this data or information is it's an approximation, because Devon and Cornwall Police have moved to a new IT system. So the diverse communities team get a download overnight of hate crime, new hate crime, recorded hate crime, that is. And I say recorded because hate crime is underreported. So this is only the hate crime that we know about because it has been reported. And this is for Plymouth. So apologies, I know this is the South Devon and Dartmouth Community Safety Partnership, but this will give you a flavour of what's going on within Devon or within Plymouth, and it's not too dissimilar in the other areas within Devon and Cornwall. And as you can see, race is the most targeted protected characteristic within Plymouth. So again, this is an approximation, but for last year, so looking between 2022 and 2023, that's January to December, within Plymouth, and I have to stipulate Plymouth, but the other 4 BCUs follow a similar trend. your protected characteristics that are unfortunately most targeted are those that fall under race, sexual orientation and disability. When we look at crime types, and I know that's a very busy slide, you're looking at your public order offences. So those are the first three within the slide on the left-hand side as you look at this screen. So your section 4 public order, your 4A and your section 5. And that's your harassment, alarm or distress. That's words or behavior that causes that harassment, alarm or distress, or cause you to fear immediate violence. And that does, as you can see, become our volume hate crime really within Plymouth. And again, the caveat is it follows the other areas. You then have what I call the lower end assaults. No assault is nice. I'm not demeaning the assault. I'm not demeaning what's happened to the victim, but we're not looking at grievous bodily harm. You know, we're not looking at puncture wounds. We're not looking at broken bones. We're looking at either pushes, shoulder knocks, grabbing of arms, and then our actual bodily harm. So we're looking at bruising or a scratch on the skin, something that just breaks the skin, but isn't a puncture wound or anything like that. So outside of that, we've got a harassment. So that's the behavior where there's a course of conduct. So on more than 2 occasions, that course of conduct will then fall under harassment. And our malicious communications, as you would imagine, is quite big. And that's where the social media that Pat was talking about, our texts, our nuisance phone calls, they all come under malicious communications, your emails and the like. The non-crime incident or hate incident, Pat covered it, so I'm not going to go too far. It has changed. It has had a massive impact on Devon and Cornwall Police and the other 42 police forces, because we've got a duty to review every non-crime hate incident and make sure that we are recording, if indeed it meets a threshold for recording a hate incident, that we are doing it in the appropriate manner, because there are times now where we can't record the details of the persons involved. I don't think that's for a topic I'll go in too far today, but just to make it very clear, every hate crime is a hate incident, but not every hate incident is a hate crime. So hate incidents, we used to record, if it came in, we would record every detail because it helped with community intelligence, it helped with building a picture of what was going on. But of course, the impact of a person who says, well, I haven't committed a crime. You can clearly see on the screen, it says non-crime. I'm going for a job, I have to have a DBS check, and my future employer comes towards me and says, what's this? The police have recorded your name against this incident, and it may hinder their future perspectives. And it was recognised by the government. So that change in law came in. My personal view also is I think the change of law came in because the government at that particular time were getting a bit of a hard time around the immigration policy. They wanted obviously the Rwanda policy to go through, and it seemed to come in very quickly overnight. That's not a Devon and Cornwall opinion. That's a John Ford as a person within the hate world saying that it feels like there's a bit the government pushed that through because they had an agenda and they were getting accused of committing hate crime offences. And what they're saying is, no, it's not. It's legislation. It's debate. It's what we're going to do for the country. And it doesn't meet that hate threshold. They reviewed the non-crime hate incidents. So we can only record details if it's a real risk of a future criminal offence. So for somebody who's in their own setting, their own house, if they were to come out with offensive racist language within their own living room, there's something called a dwelling defence, and that dwelling defence means that offence isn't committed. But if you were to put them out, out in the street and they said those same comments, they would absolutely commit a racially aggravated public order offence. So would we record those details of that person? Well, yes, we would, because there's a real risk of a future criminal offence. So hopefully that basic example gives you an idea of when we would take details for a hate incident and record those, because actually that does build a picture and could lead then to offences taking place in the future. Third party reporting. So if a person doesn't have a confidence to report hate crime to us, we now and have done for a while as part of our zero tolerance to hate crime campaign, I've had third-party reporting centres, so that could be your local authority, it could be your library, it could be the Race Equality Council, Plymouth and Devon Race Equality Council, it could be your local charities or that work with asylum seekers and refugee communities. It could be your local bus company, so Plymouth City Bus or Derriford Hospital. These are third-party reporting centres, and as it says, it's a national initiative. But the reason we have the third-party reporting is they might have a relationship with their support worker. They might have a relationship, if it's a university, with their tutor or with their professor. And that trust has already been built. They have those professional and working relationships, and they will go to that person and tell them what's happened, say, I would like it reported to the police. It can be anonymous. So, you know, the victim might say, I want the police to know about it, but I don't want my details given. That's absolutely fine. We record it. And it might not proceed. Obviously, once it's recorded, we would go to the person who's reported it and say we would like to get hold of the person who wants to remain anonymous. We might be able to give them the confidence to follow that report through. But again, we would never put pressure for that person to do so because it's underreported. Even having this third-party report that's anonymous, you know, it's important to us because then we start to get a real picture of what's going on within Devon and Cornwall. It's designed to overcome those barriers. The uniform is a barrier. A lot of my team, a lot of the diverse communities team, we wear a lot of plain clothes because then people feel safe about talking to us. They don't feel judged either through their own experiences and lived experiences of dealing with police or their communities when they see them speak to a police officer. So generally, the barriers to reporting hate crime is the low public confidence in policing because of the slow process of reporting, but hopefully that's getting better with the new online hub. Language and communication barrier for which we overcome that we have a company that provides interpreters so that we're able to overcome that because the victim is afraid of police because of those lived experiences. The experience is not important enough, or the victim is afraid of repercussions that will happen. So these are some, not all, that's not a comprehensive list of the barriers reporting. So how do the DCT engage with our communities? Well, we go to community events, we go to weekly English classes, we go to our asylum seeker refugee charities, we go to the British Red Cross, we help provide food, do cooking, meet the communities, attend Friday prayers, attend our faith groups, attend Plymouth has a synagogue, as does Exeter. So we attend services and we're just visible. You've got to be visible within these communities to build those relationships, and they've got to build the relationship with the person, and it's got to be meaningful. So as you can see here, international dinners, big link in with the University of Plymouth and the social isolation program, do a lot of inputs to schools. Sadly, whilst Pat did say hate crime is on the decline, or has been with the figures he showed you up to March 2023, that's absolutely not the case that we're seeing in Devon and Cornwall now. Hate crime is sadly on the increase. Has been steadily, probably since the new year, but obviously the Gaza conflict on the 7th of October, and then the Russian in Ukraine, which has been going on longer. But the world just seems a little bit on fire at the moment. And then obviously your pro-Palestine gatherings, you just stop oil gatherings, your extreme left, your extreme right. It's a very busy time at the moment. And we're seeing an increase in that within schools as well, sadly. So we've done presentations to over 20 schools within Plymouth in the last 12 months. But education is key, and we don't just do it alone as the diverse communities team. We either get the Intercom Trust, which is an LGBTQ+ national charity to attend, or we get the Race Equality Council to attend, because whilst we are a diversity team, we're only as good as the experiences we have, and certainly there are a lot better people placed to be able to give that advice, but we are there to go in and make sure if we see trends that we start to deal with it and start to educate. And again, obviously some of our bigger employees are there. I'm not going to go through the videos because I know I didn't get them, but I think overall I will come out now and just stop sharing and say if there's any questions, because obviously Pat's covered a lot of things as well, hopefully.
John, there is one question in the chat, and that's how do we sign up to be a third-party reporting centre?
Thank you, Rebecca. So what I can do is I will put the diverse communities teams in the chat bar in a minute while we're still talking. I will header them. Is everybody here mostly interested in South Devon, or is there a wider audience here that would like to know the 4 teams?
The 4 teams, because we were across Devon and Cornwall. There's people from across Devon and Cornwall. We will be sending an email out either tomorrow or Friday with all the information from the sessions and links. So if you could send it to us, send it to Claire or I, we'll make sure that we put all of that detail in that email. So that will be out to you in the next couple of days. Oh, and we've got somebody on the call from Bristol. So
no problem. So what I'll do is I won't put it in the chat bar then. Rebecca, if I send it to you direct, is that okay?
That's great,
and you'll have all the details of the 4 teams then. Are there any other questions? I appreciate that's a lot of information you've had to take in over the last hour and a half. If not, I shall hand back over. And thank you very much for your time.
There's one other question in relation to Pat and yourself, John, as to whether the slides are able to be circulated, or any of the slides are able to be circulated.
So perhaps not so much mine, because my data, some of them might be able to be circulated, but some of it is approximation. So the data is only what I've collated. It's not come from my performance and analysis team. So I would find that I wouldn't want to send that out because it may not be wholly accurate. What it does do, it gives people an understanding of where it is. It is data I can use, but it's not something I'd be willing to share, because if somebody said, well, look, Plymouth's got 327 race crimes, 117 under the sexual orientation protected characteristic, that could be 10 crimes out under or above.
Okay, maybe if you could just take those slides out and send us the rest, that would be great. And Pat, I'm not sure if you're able to share your slides with me for us to be able to circulate, but if you are, that's great. Particularly, I thought the last slide was really valuable with all of the contact names of the different organisations. So we'll talk about that as well. Thank you.
Certainly not a problem.
Great, thank you. Kev, back to you.
Yeah, we've got the slide up. I think we're gonna that's gonna be about a wrap. I think that is the most important thing, and I appreciate the fact that people are going to want media, because that's a really sort of, I mean, we call it a bite size, but it is that sort of palatable, digestible shot of information in order to really try and sort of reinforce our communities. I mean, we're all ambassadors and advocates for our communities, and I love the commonality of spirit that we have amongst this group, and I know that that's reflected, because this is a dark topic. It's not great. It's emblematic of something that is, as Pat and John have rightly adduced evidence of, just not positive and can be catastrophic. But thankfully, there's a lot of lights in this room at the moment, and I think they're emblematic of a lot of other lights that live within our communities that really do want to see this change for the better. But I think what John said was key to me there: engagement, linking in with one another, fostering that sense of community and really sowing into it. So I would encourage people that whilst the media is really useful, but get in touch with your local teams. I know that our colleagues within Devon County Council have an excellent directory service that we, as part of the group that we're getting together, are really going to try and push out as much as possibly can, over and above what it's been pushed out already, and that's really useful. So if you do have any sort of questions that arise, get in touch with your local community safety partnership. Please mesh in with our colleagues in the diverse communities team. The community security trust are anxious to hear from people in terms of any issues that arise. And then obviously my colleagues within the local constabulary and other third sector organisations, that those directories will raise for you. I think what we really want to do is prompt conversation and bring something that people aren't always comfortable talking about very much to the fore, so that we realise not only the harm that it causes, but the harm that we can prevent. as community safety partnerships and as community members. I think it just leaves me to say thank you all of you very much for coming. It's hugely appreciated. Having your ear is having your buy-in, and having your buy-in, I think, is a pathway to some really positive change. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think you can all go home and enjoy your tea now. Cheers. Oh, Tim, you got your hand up.
Thank you, Kev. And you can't go home and have your tea just yet. Be really grateful, really grateful if you could either use your phone to click on the QR code or click on the link that's in the chat or in front of you to help us do the evaluation form. We run a number of sessions like this, and the feedback is really valuable to us. You also got the opportunity to leave your email on there so that we can tell you about future sessions. We've got sessions coming up on serious and organised crime. We've also got sessions coming up on suicide prevention. So last word is definitely to say thank you to Kev for coordinating, thank you to Pat for a really impressive and inspiring presentation, and thank you to John for a really informative set of information, and thanks to everybody for coming along. Thanks everybody.
Bye.